when you're in pain, soothing as a springtime rain, to have a friend right in your corner. Your heart will feel a little warmer. Tender loving care, tender loving care. Each warm and friendly touch lets someone know you care so much. Tender loving care, tender loving care.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Greenbrier Almond, and thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Each week on Channel 3, I'm happy to talk about this interface between Christianity and medicine. And today, since we have just come through a 1,000-year deluge with a lot of water damage, 24 people killed, others not accounted for, I think it's important to go back and look at the greatest deluge that we've ever had, as recorded in the Bible, the story of Noah and the 40 nights, 40 days of flooding, and then the flood covering the earth for 150 days. And it's an appropriate time to do that, though we also want to say, as we talk about this, that God's promise has been that this will never happen again, that He will not destroy the earth through a flood. And we have the sign of the rainbow. The reason I want to do this also, as a doctor, I over the years, I've taken care of children who will have disruptive behavior syndrome or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or various childhood maladies that come to the attention of a psychiatrist. And invariably, as I'm trying to understand what's happening to the child, I'll come out with, what about the promises of God? What about the rainbow? What does that mean? And children have not understood the story of the rainbow in the last 10 years or so of my practice of 42 years. And that's bothered me, because I look at that and I say that's Bible illiteracy. So another reason to maybe talk about this today is just to address, at least for this audience watching today, what the Bible does say about Noah and the flood. I want to also emphasize that many people, and I'm on Facebook and in a church community, we have relatives here and out of the state, and many people are praying for West Virginia at this time, praying for the citizens of West Virginia, and praying that we do go through this recovery phase and come out on top. This is a devastating situation, and I don't want to make light of it, and I don't think it's necessarily for God's judgment that the flood has come. These things are hard to understand, and that's not even in the Bible story, except that at that time God was dismayed with mankind, and that's why the flood came. But that was then, this is now. I think what's happened here is a tragedy. Why the rains are heavier than they've been, why some of these towns have been wiped out, maybe never to rebuild, is a tragedy. One of the towns, and I'll just say we have personal ties to several folks in southern West Virginia, but one of these towns is Rainelle, West Virginia, where my mother taught school before marriage, and where my grandfather and grandmother were pastors of the local Methodist church. It was back at the time of World War II. And we visited Rainelle on many occasions. It's in Greenbrier County. It's a lovely little town. And it's just devastating to see pictures of what's happened to Rainelle. Just before the program, I saw a picture of the library books out on the lawn in front, all ruined apparently by the water. And that's a tragedy in itself, isn't it, to have books destroyed, as well as lives, as well as other properties. So this is, but this does bring us at least an opportunity to come together look at the meanings, if you will, of the rainbow and of the story of Noah. And I want to begin where the Bible does in Genesis 6th chapter. So this is early in the Bible, the book of Genesis being the first book of the Bible. And I'm going to be looking back and forth at the Message and at the New International Version and talking with you about the story. This is simply titled The Flood. This was a time on the earth, maybe not different from now, when the population was increasing. There were a lot more people. The earth had been underway, populated for some time, and it just says there was an increase in number of people on the earth. And we have certainly done that again. We are now up to about 7 billion people. And I know in my wife's country, the Philippines, where we visited 42 days this past year, they're concerned about the rising water level, the beach level, the less land as the oceans rise due to global warming. And they have also lost a lot of water, rain supply, due to the El Nino weather pattern that changes. And so things like this happen. But here we are. Even Jesus, an illustration in his time, said that when the Son of Man comes back, when Jesus comes back for a second time to be King of Kings and to rule in justice and fairness, he said it will be like the days of Noah. So the illustration here is apt that we live in a time like Noah's. Jesus said that will be the time of the second coming. And of course, at that time, this was a time of increasing evil. The Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years." So the Bible explains different things, and it's not a scientific journal, but it's accurate in many ways, isn't it? And the people had been living for a long time. Apparently, Noah was 600 years old when the flood took place. But the Bible here says that man's years will be 120. As a doctor, and I've said this on our program over the years, I was taught in physiology class at West Virginia University in 1970 that the heart, for example, is a vital organ in the body. The liver, the kidneys. The part that would let us live long easily repairs itself, easily keeps going if we would use the right nourishment, the right exercise, the right rest. Our organs would live easily 120 years. So this is not out of question what is attributed to God, but that's just one example of where there's a parallel. Now, do we live 120 years? No, but we have increased our lifespan. And I suspect someone born in 1948, like myself, could expect to live to be about 78. And that's fine. I'm 68 now, and I'm enjoying every day, especially with the grandchildren. But in Noah's time, then, God seems to be setting a limit, 120 years. And then he goes on, and it's recorded, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness was on the earth. And every inclination of his heart was toward evil. Jeremiah, and I used this over the years in my own practice of medicine, said, the heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And as I would listen to stories, man's inhumanity to man, children being abused would be a prime example in my case, but many examples of man's inhumanity to man and evil. And as it says here in the Bible, God himself was looking down and looking at the situation, and he saw every inclination of man toward evil. And it sickened him. It sickens all of us too, doesn't it? And so God said, I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and women and creatures that move above the ground, birds of the air, for I am grieved. that I have made them. But Noah found favor in God's eyes. In the end, the Bible is recording here that 8 people were saved, 2 of every kind of animal. In some cases, I went back to read this, there were more than 2. With birds, there were sometimes 7 pairs, so that they would not die out during that time of the flood when they were confined in the ark. I don't remember hearing that before, but I'm reading that now and seeing that God had reasons for whatever He did, how many He saved. But in any event, down to 8 human beings, and that was because of the wickedness. Now, are we any better today? No. We have a bend toward sin, toward evil, even now, don't we? We argue in our country about various things, debate. Sometimes it gets pretty heated. People have family feuds. They kill each other some 14 times in West Virginia most years, as I can see it. And then we have an increasing suicide rate due to opioids. All sorts of things that we could call evil are happening around us. So we are pretty much like the times of Noah. Well, but Noah was righteous. Noah was counted as righteous, and therefore God said, I'm going to save Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, their wives, and the animals. In this one account then, he says, I'll get rid of my ruined creation. I'll make a clean sweep. People, animals, snakes, bugs, birds, the works. I'm sorry I made them. This is in the Message, an informal version of the Bible, but I like that. He makes a clean sweep. And then in the end, there's violence everywhere. He says, I'll make a clean sweep. And the ship is made out of teak wood. Again, this is a detail I didn't remember when I was thinking about this, but in light of the West Virginia floods and my reading here of Noah, he's made the ship out of teak wood. You can see a lot of teak wood now in furniture made in Indonesia and Malaysia and the Philippines that makes its way into America. And it's a good wood. It's easy to work with. It's a good wood. He makes the ship 400 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. Oral Roberts, and I've mentioned this over the years, I taught in his medical school at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma for several years, was residency training director there, and Oral Roberts was trying to create a new model of healthcare, and he got many things right. He was combining prayer and medicine. He got that right, but he was wanting to, as a model, then follow biblical models, and so he built the medical center physically on the model of the ark. So the building was 450 feet long across the front, 75 feet deep, and then 45 feet tall. And on top of that 4-story tower that he built, or that bottom, that base that he built, like a ship, then he had these towers that came up. Our hospital tower was 30 stories tall. Our office tower was 60 stories tall, and our research tower was 20 stories tall. So it was a massive building by any account. Most people who came to Tulsa were amazed to see such a huge building out in the middle of the Great Plains on the campus of Oral Roberts University. And we who were doctors gave Oral Roberts a great deal of credit and said that no one else could raise that amount of money to build debt-free a hospital and a medical complex like that. But he did, and to the glory of God, and we appreciated that. But the dimensions, he was very careful about the dimensions, and it was interesting how big that is. That's a football field and a half long, if you want to think about it that way. And so it's quite a large building. Well, it needs to be large, obviously. 3 decks. The ark's described as having a lower, a middle, and an upper deck. all of that would be necessary for the animals that Noah had to carry, the amount of life. Now, how did they all come together? I don't know. That would be God's doing. He says, I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wives and daughters, and the animals. All of them were willingly entering the ark. Pretty amazing. So that's the first sort of beginning of it. Now there's also things that I didn't see in the reading of the story, but I understand that it took Noah a long time to make a boat this size, and there was no rain when he made the boat. That's a little saying I've heard and seen on Facebook. Remember, it wasn't raining when Noah built the ark. He was a man of faith. But 120 years is how long I've heard that it took him to make it. Certainly a long time to have the chiding and the sneers and the snickers of his neighbors, those who didn't believe that God had spoken to him, that didn't understand what he was doing and why he was doing it. And Noah himself probably didn't understand exactly why he was doing it. There are many people who have a mission in life, and they don't get to see it accomplished. They don't understand maybe why they were set out on that mission, but they were, and they do what they can, and maybe they don't even see the result of it. One time, Dr. Dobson, a Christian psychologist, I followed his career, focused on the family, and as he got near the end of his career, someone said to him, well, Dr. Dobson, don't you consider yourself a failure? Because you call your group Focus on the Family, and you uphold the family, and yet the family is falling apart. And he said, well, no, not really. He said, I did what God told me to do. I focused on the family. I brought all my attention to bear on that subject, and he did everything he could. His radio programs and videotapes and all the things that he did, he was careful to do what God told him to do. But that doesn't mean that it actually turned out well. And it was not clear probably to Noah how this was going to turn out, that there was going to be a flood. Maybe God didn't even tell him that, but he did what God told him to do. Oral Roberts was asked at the end of as his medical center was closing, this massive building I've already indicated, built on the proportions of the ark, and this massive building was then abandoned. The medical school closed down after about 9 or 10 years, and folks like us had to leave. We came back to West Virginia, and some people asked Oral Roberts, well, do you consider it a failure? He said, no, I was called upon to combine prayer and medicine. I was called upon to build the building according to the proportions that I built it, and I did what God told me to do. And I look at it now in a lifetime of seeing the changes in medicine that Oral Roberts was doing a good thing. He was getting us away from the business model of medicine. He was getting us back to the caring model. We call our program Tender Loving Care. As medicine practice as a ministry, as a calling, missionary medicine, things like that are very important and vital. We have gone off in a different direction. We now have a very expensive care. The deductibles for people's care now is many times over what the total bill used to be, and the costs keep going up, and so we've gone a different direction, but I don't think there was a waste of what Oral Roberts did. In any event, it closed. Dr. Dobson's radio programs and so forth, he's off stage. Those things passed, but they were doing what God told them to do. Now, in the 7th chapter of Genesis, the Lord then said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. take with you 7 of every kind of the clean animal, a male and female, and 2 of every kind of the unclean animal, and also 7 of every kind of bird, and various kinds. You know, in cartoons we always see the 2 by 2 coming in, and maybe there were, but there were 7 of some kinds, the Bible records. And maybe they were more fragile. I'm not sure why God wanted that. And then Noah was 600 years old when this began. Actually, then when it began to rain and the animals were gathered, it took about a year to gather the animals. I don't know how they fed them in that time. That's hard to imagine, but all this came together. And then, of course, the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The other thing that happened, this was an interesting thing. My father, as a doctor, we would make house calls into the county, and he would always be interested in an artesian spring. An artesian spring. I'm not sure with the mining of coal if we've not dried up all these artesian springs, but it used to be. You could go to where a farmhouse was located, maybe where a school, one of these one-room schools out in the county, maybe where some of the churches are located, and there would be a wonderful spring coming up out of the mountain, out of the soil, and it would be bubbling up. I mean, you know, profusely. It might be a half foot high, a foot high, a very, very large spring of water coming up out of the ground. And he called them artesian springs. In particular, the one at Sago, we'd always stop it there. I mean, we were never tired of wanting to go there. And there was a gas well, or not a gas well, but gas was bubbling up through the spring to the point that this was natural. This was not any when mankind doing this, but the bubbles were there, and they were gas bubbles. So you could take a match and light the spring, and then it would be bubbling with fire coming out the top, and it was sort of like an eternal flame if they could keep it going. Though it seemed to must go out sometimes because we would always be the one lighting it again. But the earth began to bubble is what I want to say from the Bible standpoint here as I tell this story, so that doesn't happen. It does happen for 40 days and 40 nights, and then there's the flood, of course, and then in the end the springs are drying up again. So there are springs like this. I live on a spring like that on this property. Where we've lived for 36 years, we have a street downtown in Buchanan called Spring Street. And one might imagine that there's a spring there. And I never quite associated that until I was able to, my family and I live in the former Young house, the Stewart house, Stewart Young Almond house now. And we have springs on our property where the water bubbles up. Now, I took that as a sign that I could plant plants here easily, and they would do well. And indeed, I have 25 black walnuts, and then a lot of other kinds of trees. And the number of plants we have are about not drying up the spring, but using the spring water. But these things happen in nature, and certainly they're deserve mention by Moses, who's writing this story down historically, and writing the story of Noah. None of that, by the way, and I'm telling this as a story as I would tell my granddaughters, and as I would sit in my office with a child who needed to know a lesson about life, and I would want to make a point with them about God's intervention or God's promises, including the sign, what's the sign of the rainbow means, and we have, unfortunately, children in our county, I would say many children who do not know the meaning of these stories or have never even heard these stories. They're biblically illiterate, would be my take on it. And yet, at times like this, when we have a major flood, a deluge in our state, these stories are comforting to us for the lessons they teach us. Let me make one other point here, and we'll pick this program up as a second part, because there's 4 chapters devoted in the Bible to Noah, and we're just really talking about the first 2 chapters this time. So all the animals are shut in, the Bible says, and it begins to rain, and so they're all preserved. They have all the food they need, and you'll store that up, God says, and so Noah does that. Noah did everything God commanded him to do. I think that would be lesson 1, isn't it? Why is Noah counted as righteous? Because though he could not see everything that God would do, how can you want to imagine a flood where the tallest mountain on earth would have at least 20 feet of water above it, according to the Bible? And he ends up, this ark is up on top of a mountain when the waters finally recede, after 40 days of flooding and then 150 days for the water to go down. How could he imagine being up on top of a mountain? He could not imagine it, but he did what God wanted him to do. And that would be lesson 1. Well, until the next time, this is Dr. Greenbrier Allman thanking you for joining us on our program. I hope you tune in for the second part of what is not just a children's story, but a lesson on life, and of course a biblical story of righteousness and faith. God counted Noah righteous, and that's why we're still here, according to the Bible, because God's intention at that moment was to wipe out all life and to start again. I hope that you are dry at home now. I hope that you're having a good summer, that you feel safe. But that does not mean that we're secure, does it? Jesus said in the closing of our age, that things would look like Noah's time, and then the Son of Man will come. And that's looking that way more and more. Well, until the next time, this is Dr. Greenbrier Allman again, thanking you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Special thanks to Channel 3 for this opportunity to come your way each week. We'll see you next week.
Stories of a West Virginia Doctor, written by Dr. Harold D. Allman. A collection of 55 short stories about his experience as a small-town doctor in central West Virginia. And Tender Loving Care, Stories from a West Virginia Doctor, Volume 2, written by Dr. Greenbrier Allman, using videotapes to write 70 additional stories of his father's very colorful life as a small-town doctor. They can be found for purchase at Amazon.com and most local bookstores. Tune into Channel 3 Buckhannon for Tender Loving Care with Dr. Greenbrier Allman, where he talks about the connection between Christianity and medicine.